I ruined my marriage on our wedding night. I called it closure and met the man I almost married, but my husband later got a forwarded photographer thread with timestamps and hallway camera stills. 3 weeks later, at our vendor appointment, he showed up with an annulment petition and witnesses who saw me disappear during our reception. I'm Legaya Ashford, and I have always believed that a single conversation should not define a person's entire character. Which is why I told myself that talking to Dominic Vale at my own wedding reception was not a betrayal, but simply an act of closure that any mature adult would understand. We were standing in the hotel reception ballroom on the evening of May 15th, surrounded by 300 guests who had travelled from across the country to watch Owen and me exchange vows. And I was holding a crystal champagne flute near the fountain when I spotted Dominic across the crowded dance floor talking to my maid of honour, Natalie. My chest tightened in a way I had not expected, and I felt the old familiar pull of curiosity and unfinished business that I thought I had buried 5 years ago when he left for Singapore without proposing or even asking me to wait for him. Owen was busy near the photo backdrop, thanking his groomsmen and posing for pictures with his mother Margaret and his sister Simone. And I told myself that one quick conversation with Dominic would not hurt anyone because I deserved to prove to myself that I had moved on and made the right choice marrying a stable, reliable man instead of chasing someone who had already walked away from me once. I caught Dominic's eye from across the room, and he tilted his head slightly toward the exit in a gesture that felt like a secret language we had invented years ago. And without overthinking it, I set my champagne flute on a passing server's tray and walked toward the side door marked Staff Only that led to the hotel's service corridors. The hallway beyond the ballroom was narrow and dimly lit, lined with utility carts stacked with folded linens and extra glassware. And the sound of the orchestra playing our first dance song was muffled and distant, almost dreamlike in its faintness. Dominic was waiting near the elevator bank, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets. And he smiled at me in that way that used to make me feel like the most important person in any room. And he asked if I was happy with the way my life had turned out. I said of course I was happy, but my voice wavered slightly because the question felt heavier than it should have. And he said I looked more beautiful now than I did 5 years ago, which made me laugh nervously and shift my weight from one foot to the other in my uncomfortable wedding heels. We talked for what I thought was only a few minutes, but when I glanced at my watch, it had been 30 minutes. And I knew I should go back to the reception because Owen would be looking for me, and guests would be wondering where the bride had disappeared to during her own celebration. Dominic asked if I ever thought about what could have been if he had stayed, and I said sometimes, which was not entirely honest because the truth was I thought about it constantly during the months leading up to the wedding. And he reached out and touched my wrist gently and said he had made a mistake leaving me behind without giving us a real chance. His hand was warm against my skin, and I felt something shift inside me, a dangerous combination of nostalgia and validation and recklessness. And before I could stop myself or think about the consequences, I leaned forward and kissed him in that shadowy service corridor while my husband danced with his mother just 100 feet away on the other side of the wall. The kiss lasted longer than it should have, and when I finally pulled away and looked at my phone, I saw that it was past midnight, which meant I had been gone for more than 2 hours, and panic started to creep into my chest as I straightened my dress and wiped the lipstick from the corner of my mouth. I told Dominic this could not happen again, and he said I did not really mean that, and I said I did mean it because I had a husband and a life and responsibilities. But even as I said the words, I knew they sounded hollow and unconvincing. I walked back toward the ballroom on unsteady legs, my heart pounding, and when I pushed through the side door, I saw Owen standing near the exit with his mother and sister, all 3 of them looking worried and scanning the thinning crowd. I forced a bright smile onto my face and breezed over to them, apologizing quickly and saying I had been dealing with a last-minute catering issue in the kitchen and had lost track of time while helping the staff sort out a problem with the dessert service. Owen asked where I had been for 2 full hours, and I said it had not been 2 hours, maybe 45 minutes at most. And Simone glanced at her watch and said the last time anyone saw me was at 10 o'clock when I was standing near the champagne fountain. I laughed and told her she must have lost track of time too, because weddings always feel longer than they are. And Margaret's expression was tight and unreadable as she watched me deflect and dodge the question. And Owen's face showed a mixture of confusion and hurt that I tried to ignore by changing the subject and suggesting we say goodbye to the remaining guests. The reception ended shortly after that, and we rode the elevator up to the honeymoon suite in uncomfortable silence. And when Owen asked me again where I had really been, I accused him of not trusting me on our wedding night, which I knew was a cruel deflection, but I said it anyway because I was not ready to face the truth of what I had just done. Owen went quiet after that, turning away from me and unpacking his suitcase in slow, deliberate movements, and I went to bed alone in my wedding dress, relieved that the conversation was over and certain that he would forget about the whole thing by morning. I lay in the dark listening to him move around the suite, and I told myself that the kiss did not count because the marriage was only a few hours old, and nothing that happened during the reception could really threaten a relationship that had barely started. And I convinced myself that this was just a moment of weakness that I could bury and never think about again. The next morning when I woke up, Owen was already dressed and sitting on the balcony with his phone in his hand, and when I asked if he had slept, he said not much, and I suggested we enjoy the day and maybe go to the beach. But he said he had a headache and needed some time to think. I asked if he was still upset about the previous night, and he said he did not know what he felt, just that something did not add up, and he could not shake the feeling that I was not telling him the whole truth. His phone buzzed on the table and he glanced at it quickly before dismissing a notification, and I saw a calendar entry flash on the screen that read Laurel Street 4 p.m. in plain text with no other context. I asked what he needed to do on Laurel Street, and he said it was nothing urgent, just picking up something he had ordered before the wedding. And I shrugged and went to take a shower, assuming it was some kind of errand related to our honeymoon trip or a wedding vendor payment that he had forgotten to finalize. I did not realize that the calendar entry was the first quiet step in a plan that would unravel everything I thought I had protected by lying. And I did not understand that Owen had already started to notice the inconsistencies in my story and was beginning to question whether the woman he married was the same person he thought he knew. I woke up the next morning in the honeymoon suite expecting Owen to have forgotten about the previous night's tension. But when I walked onto the hotel breakfast terrace at 9 o'clock, I found him already seated at a table overlooking the city, staring at his coffee cup with an expression that seemed far away and disconnected. Other wedding guests were scattered across the terrace, waving cheerfully at us from nearby tables, and I sat down across from Owen and tried to start a light conversation about how beautiful the reception had been and how many people had complimented the floral arrangements. He nodded politely but did not engage, and when I asked if he was still upset about my disappearance during the reception, he said he was not upset, just tired. And I suggested we should focus on enjoying our mini-moon before we flew to Greece the following week. Owen said he was not sure Greece was a good idea right now, and when I asked why not, he said we needed to talk about finances first and make sure we were on the same page about expenses, which seemed like an odd thing to worry about on the morning after our wedding. I called him a buzzkill and tried to laugh it off, but he did not smile. And a waiter came by to refill our coffee while I scrolled through my phone looking at photos from the reception that guests had already posted on social media. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at the screen quickly before flipping it face down on the table, and I noticed Owen watching me with an expression I could not quite read, as if he were cataloguing every small movement and reaction for some purpose I did not yet understand. We finished breakfast in near silence, and when we returned to the suite to pack our things before checkout, Owen suggested we drive home separately because he had an errand to run and did not want to make me wait. Which seemed strange, but I agreed because I was relieved to have some time alone to think about what had happened with Dominic and whether I should feel guilty or simply accept it as a moment that would fade into irrelevance over time. 3 days after the wedding, we were back in our newlywed apartment unpacking wedding gifts that had been delivered while we were at the hotel, and I opened a set of crystal champagne flutes and joked that we should celebrate surviving the chaos of the wedding weekend. Owen did not respond, and when I asked what was wrong with him lately, he said he had been thinking about the reception timeline and could not stop wondering where I had really been for those 2 hours. I told him he needed to let it go because obsessing over a minor miscommunication was not healthy, and he said 2 hours was not a minor miscommunication. It was a significant gap that no one could account for, and I accused him of interrogating me like a detective instead of trusting me like a husband. He asked which vendors I had been helping during those 2 hours, and I said the florist and the DJ, and he quietly pointed out that the florist had left at 9:30 and the DJ had been on stage the entire evening and never saw me. And I felt my face flush with anger and defensiveness as I told him his paranoia was exhausting and unfair. The following week, I returned to work at my corporate hospitality firm, coordinating a product launch event for a tech client. And I was sitting at my desk reviewing catering contracts when my co-worker Jenny stopped by and asked how the wedding had been. I told her it was perfect, and she said she thought she had seen me at a coffee shop downtown last Thursday with a tall guy in a suit. And I quickly said it must have been someone else because I had been home unpacking all day Thursday. Jenny said she was pretty sure it was me, and I insisted it was not. And she dropped the subject, but her expression suggested she did not believe me. And as soon as she walked away, I pulled out my phone and texted Dominic saying that people were starting to notice us meeting in public and we needed to be more careful. He replied within seconds saying we should just tell people we were old friends catching up, and I said that explanation would not work with Owen. And he sent back a laughing emoji that made me feel both excited and anxious at the same time. 10 days after the wedding, Owen came home from a meeting he had not explained to me beforehand, and when I asked where he had been, he said he was running errands. And I said he had been distant and cold since the wedding and I wanted to know what was going on with him. He said he had been thinking about whether we rushed into marriage without really knowing each other. And I told him that was a horrible thing to say after we had just committed our lives to each other in front of everyone we knew. He said he was just being honest, and I said honesty was supposed to build trust, not destroy it. And he said trust was built on truth and he was not sure he had the full truth about what happened during our wedding reception. I walked into the bedroom and slammed the door, and through the wall I could hear Owen opening his laptop and typing, and I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling wondering how long he would keep punishing me for something that barely even mattered in the grand scheme of our marriage. Later that evening I checked Owen's laptop while he was in the shower, trying to see what he had been working on so obsessively, but I found that his browser history had been cleared and his cloud storage password had been changed, which struck me as paranoid and secretive. I went to bed without saying goodnight, and when I woke up in the middle of the night, I saw light coming from under the door of the second bedroom, which we had been using as a home office, and I heard the faint sound of typing and clicking that suggested Owen was awake and working on something he did not want me to see. The next morning when I came into the living room, Owen's laptop was closed and sitting on the coffee table, and next to it was a calendar notification on his phone that read, Pine Avenue, 11:30 a.m. And when I asked what was happening on Pine Avenue, he said it was just another errand, nothing important. And I decided not to push the issue because I did not want another argument about trust and transparency. 2 weeks after the wedding, I met Dominic for lunch at a coffee shop near the courthouse, telling Owen I was meeting a client to discuss a venue contract, and we sat by the window in a booth toward the back where I thought no one would see us. I told Dominic this had to be the last time we met because my marriage was starting to suffer from the secrecy and suspicion, and he said if my marriage were really that important, I would not be sitting across from him right now. And I did not have a good answer to that observation. He reached across the table and touched my hand, and I did not pull away, and I told myself that this was just closure, just a conversation between two adults who used to care about each other, and it did not mean anything more than that. What I did not know was that a mutual friend named Aaron was walking past the coffee shop at that exact moment, and he saw us through the window, did a double take, pulled out his phone, and took a photo of Dominic's hand on mine before texting it to Owen with the message, "Saw this today. Thought you should know." Owen's phone buzzed during dinner that evening while I was talking about the Greece trip and going through possible itineraries, and he picked it up, glanced at the screen, and set it back down without saying anything. I asked if everything was okay, and he said yes, fine, and I asked who had texted him, and he said it was just work, and I went back to talking about the honeymoon plans while Owen excused himself and walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. Through the wall, I heard him opening his laptop again, and I wondered what he was doing but decided not to follow him because I was tired of feeling like I was under surveillance in my own home. What I did not know was that Owen had just opened a new document on his laptop, titled it Timeline May to June, and begun typing a detailed log of every discrepancy, every unexplained absence, every lie I had told since the wedding night, and his phone was lighting up on the desk beside him with a new calendar entry that read, Pine Avenue, 11:30 a.m., marked complete, with a new entry below it scheduled for the following week. I decided 3 weeks after the wedding that I needed to stop hiding my friendship with Dominic and start acting like a confident, independent woman who did not need permission to have coffee with an old friend. So on a Friday evening, I told Owen I was going out for drinks with co-workers and drove downtown to meet Dominic at a rooftop bar that was popular with young professionals. The bar was crowded and loud, filled with people in business casual attire celebrating the end of the work week, and Dominic was already seated at a corner table with a bottle of wine when I arrived, and he stood to greet me with a hug that lasted a few seconds longer than it should have. We sat down and talked about his work in marketing and my upcoming product launch event, and I felt relaxed and appreciated in a way I had not felt with Owen in weeks. And I leaned in close when Dominic told a funny story about a client disaster, laughing louder than necessary because the wine was making me feel bold and carefree. What I did not notice was that a former college friend named Maya was standing near the bar with her own group of friends, and she spotted me across the room, pulled out her phone, and recorded a short video of Dominic and me laughing together with his hand resting casually on the back of my chair. Maya sent the video to Natalie, my maid of honor, with a caption that read, "Isn't this Ligea? Who's the guy?" And Natalie watched the video twice, felt a knot form in her stomach, took a screenshot, and saved it to her phone without responding because she was beginning to realize that the rumors about my wedding night disappearance might have been more serious than she wanted to believe. I stayed at the rooftop bar until almost midnight, and when I finally came home, Owen was already in the second bedroom with the door closed, and I assumed he was asleep or working late. So I went to bed without checking on him. On Monday morning, I arrived at my corporate office and was immediately called into a conference room by my manager, Richard, who closed the door and told me he had received an anonymous email over the weekend suggesting I had been using company time for personal meetings that were not related to client business. I told him that was ridiculous and completely untrue, and he said the email included photos of me at a downtown coffee shop during work hours 2 weeks earlier. And I quickly explained that I had been scouting a potential venue for a client event, which was technically within my job responsibilities. Richard said the client name mentioned in my calendar did not exist in our company system, and I stammered slightly and said it was a preliminary inquiry that had not been formally entered yet, and he said he would let it go this time, but I needed to be more careful about appearances and documentation because the company had strict policies about personal use of work hours. I left the meeting feeling furious and paranoid, convinced that someone from Owen's family or friend group was trying to sabotage my career, and I immediately texted Dominic saying we needed to stop meeting in public places where people could see us and take photos. He replied asking if I was ashamed of him, and I said no. I just did not want to deal with drama and gossip, and he said if I really cared about avoiding drama, I should just tell Owen the truth and let the chips fall where they may. Which was easy for him to say because he had nothing to lose while I had a marriage and a reputation at stake. That evening when I came home, Owen was sitting on the couch with his laptop open, and when I vented about the unfair accusation from my manager, he asked calmly if the accusation was true. And I said of course not. And he asked who I had been meeting at the coffee shop, and I said no one. It was just a work errand. And he pointed out that I had just contradicted myself by saying it was no one and then saying it was work. I accused him of twisting my words and siding with anonymous strangers over his own wife, and he said he was not siding with anyone. He was just trying to understand the facts. And I told him facts did not matter when trust had already been broken by his constant suspicion and surveillance. He said trust was broken when facts were hidden, and I grabbed my purse and walked out of the apartment, driving aimlessly for an hour before parking in a grocery store lot and crying in my car because everything was spiraling out of control and I could not figure out how to stop it. When I finally checked my phone, I had 3 missed calls from Owen and a text from Dominic asking if I was okay, and I replied to Dominic but ignored Owen because I was not ready to face another interrogation about my schedule and my choices. The following Sunday, Owen's mother Margaret invited us to dinner at her house, and his sister Simone was there as well. and the entire meal felt tense and awkward, as if everyone were waiting for someone else to say something important. Margaret asked how our honeymoon planning was going, and I said we had postponed the Greece trip temporarily, and Margaret asked why, and I said Owen was being difficult about finances and priorities, and Owen immediately corrected me and said that was not the real reason for the postponement. Margaret asked what the real reason was, and Owen said we were working through some trust issues that needed to be resolved before we could take a big international trip together. And I laughed bitterly and said Owen did not trust me because I had talked to an old friend at our wedding reception, making it sound as trivial as possible. Simone set down her fork and asked which old friend I was referring to, and I said it was no one important, just someone from my past. And Simone said she had heard from Natalie that it was Dominic Vale, my ex-boyfriend who had been invited to the wedding. And I felt the blood drain from my face as I asked who had told Simone that information. Simone said Natalie had mentioned it in passing when they were discussing the wedding photos, and I immediately called Natalie a gossip who did not understand boundaries. And Margaret interrupted and said the issue was not whether Natalie was a gossip, but whether the information was true or false. I did not answer right away, and Margaret said she had paid for half of our wedding, and she deserved to know if her son's marriage was already falling apart after less than a month. And I said the marriage was fine and Owen was overreacting to a harmless conversation. And Owen quietly said he had photo evidence of multiple meetings that went far beyond a single conversation at the reception. Margaret asked if I was denying that the meetings had happened, and I said I was denying that they meant anything significant. And Simone said disappearing for 2 hours on your wedding night was significant, no matter how you tried to spin it. And I asked when Simone had talked to the wedding photographer about my whereabouts. Simone said she had picked up her bridesmaid photos the previous week, and Iris, the photographer, had mentioned that there was a strange gap in the reception timeline where no photos of me existed for over 2 hours, and Iris had seemed confused about it when she was organising the album. I felt trapped and exposed, and Margaret stood up from the table and said she thought it was time for me to leave because this conversation was going nowhere productive. And Owen stayed seated while I grabbed my coat and walked out of the house, humiliated and angry and convinced that his entire family was conspiring against me. I sat in my car outside Margaret's house for nearly 10 minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel, replaying the dinner conversation in my mind and feeling the walls of my carefully constructed story collapsing around me with every question Simone and Margaret had asked. I pulled out my phone and texted Dominic saying that everything was falling apart, and I did not know how much longer I could keep pretending that our meetings were innocent. And he replied within seconds asking if I wanted to come over to his apartment, and without thinking about the consequences, I started the car and drove across town toward his building. What I did not notice was Owen's car parked half a block down from his mother's house, or the way he watched me pull away from the curb before taking a photo of my license plate with a timestamp displayed clearly on his phone screen, adding another piece of documentation to the growing file he had been building since the wedding reception. I arrived at Dominic's apartment just after 8 o'clock that evening, and we sat on his couch drinking wine while I complained about how unfair Owen and his family were being. And Dominic listened with an expression of sympathy and understanding that made me feel validated and supported. He said I deserved better than a husband who questioned my every move and treated me like a criminal instead of a partner. And I agreed wholeheartedly. And when he put his arm around my shoulders, I leaned into him and stayed at his apartment until nearly 3 in the morning, knowing full well that Owen would be awake when I got home and that this choice would have consequences I was not ready to face. When I finally walked through the door of our apartment, Owen was sitting in the living room with a single lamp on, and he looked at me with an expression that was neither angry nor hurt, but simply distant, as if he were looking at a stranger whose behaviour no longer surprised or disappointed him. He asked where I had been, and I said I needed space after the humiliating dinner at his mother's house, and he asked if I had been with Dominic. And I did not answer, and he said my silence was answer enough. I said he was pushing me away with his constant suspicion and interrogation, and he said I was pushing him away with my constant lies and deflection, and I told him if he could not trust me, then maybe we should not be married, expecting him to backtrack and apologize and beg me to stay. Instead, he stood up calmly and said he was moving his things into the second bedroom. And I said that was a dramatic overreaction. And he said it was a necessary boundary. And when I asked if he was giving up on our marriage, he said I had given up on our marriage the moment I chose to disappear with another man during our wedding reception. The next morning, I tried to talk to Owen through the closed bedroom door, telling him we needed to see a couples therapist to work through our problems. And he said therapy required honesty, and he did not believe I was capable of being honest with him or with myself. I promised I would cut off all contact with Dominic, and Owen said I should have done that weeks ago without needing to be threatened or pressured. And I said everyone makes mistakes. And he said not everyone makes mistakes repeatedly over the course of a month, and then gaslights their spouse when confronted with evidence. I asked what he wanted from me, and he said he wanted space to figure out what he wanted to do next, and I asked if he was considering divorce, and he did not answer, but I heard him moving boxes and organizing belongings on the other side of the door, and the silence felt heavier than any words he could have spoken. Later that afternoon, I called my mother Paula from the office bathroom, and I told her Owen was being unreasonable and cruel, and she asked what had happened to cause this level of conflict so early in the marriage. I said Owen was accusing me of cheating, and Paula asked if the accusation was true, and I said it was complicated. And she said it was not complicated because either I had betrayed my vows or I had not. And there was no middle ground when it came to marital fidelity. I tried to explain that I had only talked to Dominic a few times and Owen was blowing everything out of proportion. And Paula asked how many times was a few times. And I did not answer. And she said she would call Owen herself to try to smooth things over because she did not want our family name dragged through a public divorce less than a month after an expensive wedding. That evening, Owen's phone rang while he was in the second bedroom, and I listened from the hallway as he spoke to my mother in a calm, measured voice, explaining that I had been dishonest about repeated contact with my ex-boyfriend and that he had photo evidence, witness statements, and a documented timeline showing a pattern of deception. Paula asked if he was planning to divorce me, and Owen said he was considering an annulment based on fraud and concealment. And Paula said she hoped he would think about the impact on both families' reputations, and Owen said reputation was not his priority. Protecting himself and his future was his priority, and he thanked her politely before ending the call. I stepped back from the door before Owen came out, and when he saw me in the hallway he asked how much I had heard, and I said enough to know he was trying to turn my own mother against me, and he said he was simply answering her questions honestly, which was something I apparently could not do. The next day I drove to Margaret's house without calling ahead, hoping to explain my side of the story and convince her that Owen was being unfair. But when I rang the doorbell, Margaret opened the door only a few inches and did not invite me inside. I said I wanted to explain what really happened, and Margaret said there was nothing to explain because the facts were already clear. And I said Owen was misinterpreting innocent meetings as something more serious. And Margaret said, disappearing for 2 hours on your wedding night while your husband searched for you was not an innocent meeting. It was a betrayal of the most fundamental commitment a person can make. I asked if Margaret would ever be able to forgive me, and she said forgiveness was not the issue, because forgiveness was something that could be offered after genuine remorse and changed behavior. But trust was something that could not be rebuilt on a foundation of lies and manipulation. She closed the door in my face and I stood on the porch feeling humiliated and abandoned. And when I turned to walk back to my car, I saw Simone watching from an upstairs window with her arms crossed and an expression that was neither sympathetic nor hostile, but simply resolute, as if she had made up her mind about me weeks ago and nothing I could say would change it. That night, Owen sat in the second bedroom with his laptop open, adding new entries to his timeline document. The date I went to Dominic's apartment until 3 in the morning. The phone call with Paula where she attempted to pressure him into reconciliation. The confrontation at Margaret's house where I was refused entry. And a note about my continued refusal to take responsibility for my actions. His phone buzzed with a text from Iris, the photographer, saying she had the reception photos ready for review and had also found the email thread she had mentioned earlier. The one she had accidentally sent to me instead of her assistant, and she said Owen should come by her studio on Thursday to see everything. Owen replied, immediately confirming the appointment for 2 o'clock, and he closed his laptop and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling while across the apartment I cried in the master bedroom. calling Dominic and begging him to tell me everything would be okay, and his silence on the other end of the line told me more than any words could have. I woke up on Thursday morning with a sense of dread I could not fully explain. And when I walked into the living room, I found Owen sitting at the dining table with his leather portfolio open in front of him, carefully organizing documents into separate sections with colored tabs. He did not look up when I entered the room, and when I asked what he was working on, he said he was preparing materials for a meeting. And I asked what kind of meeting required that level of organization, and he said it was a personal matter that did not concern me anymore. I asked if he was meeting with a lawyer, and he said he had been meeting with several professionals over the past few weeks to make sure he understood his options and his rights. And I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me as I realized he had been planning something significant while I was busy trying to manage the social fallout. I sat down across from him and told him I would do anything to save our marriage, and he asked if I was willing to cut off all contact with Dominic permanently. And I hesitated for just a moment before answering, and that hesitation was all the confirmation he needed. He said the fact that I could not answer immediately told him everything he needed to know about my priorities. And I tried to explain that it was not that simple because Dominic and I had unresolved history, and Owen said marriage was supposed to be about choosing your spouse over your past. I asked if he was planning to file for divorce, and he said he was considering all his legal options. And I asked when he would make a decision, and he said very soon, possibly within the next week. That afternoon, Owen left the apartment without telling me where he was going, and I watched from the window as he drove away with the leather portfolio on the passenger seat. And I immediately called Dominic and told him Owen was definitely planning to divorce me. Dominic said maybe that was for the best because it would free me up to be with someone who actually appreciated me. And I said I did not want a divorce. I wanted to save my marriage. And he said if I really wanted to save my marriage, I would not be calling him right now. And he hung up before I could respond. When Owen finally came home just before dinner time, he looked calm and resolved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. And he told me he would be staying at his mother's house for a few days while he sorted out some logistics. I asked if he was coming back, and he said he did not know yet. And I asked if our marriage was over, and he said legally that would depend on a judge's decision. But emotionally, the marriage had ended on May 15th when I chose to betray him on the night we were supposed to be celebrating our commitment. He picked up his suitcase and walked toward the door, and I followed him, asking when I would hear from him again. And he said I would hear from him through his attorney once the paperwork was ready. And then he left without looking back. I stood in the empty apartment surrounded by half-unpacked wedding gifts and unopened honeymoon brochures, and my phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Wedding album review. Final appointment. Iris Chen Photography Studio, Tuesday 3 p.m. Please confirm attendance. I confirmed the appointment automatically, assuming it was just a routine follow-up to review the final album layout. And I did not think anything more about it because I was too focused on the fact that Owen had just walked out with a suitcase and a lawyer's phone number. The next few days passed in a blur of anxious waiting and unanswered text messages. And on Monday evening, I received a text from Natalie saying she could not be my maid of honor anymore if I was going to continue lying to everyone about what really happened at the wedding. She said Maya had sent her a video from the rooftop bar and multiple people had seen me with Dominic around town, and she could not keep defending me when the evidence was so clear. I tried to call her, but she did not answer. And I realized I was losing not just my husband, but my entire social support system. On Tuesday afternoon, I drove to Iris Chen's photography studio for the album review appointment. And when I walked in, I was surprised to see Owen's car already parked in the lot. And when I walked through the studio door, I saw him sitting at a conference table with Iris, and there was a third person beside him, a woman in a navy blazer who introduced herself as Owen's attorney. I felt my stomach drop as I realized this was not a routine album review. This was an ambush. And Owen said this was a necessary meeting to clarify some facts and present documentation. And Iris looked uncomfortable as she slid a printed report across the table toward me, showing photo metadata, timestamps, and a detailed timeline of exactly where I had been during our wedding reception. And I knew in that moment that everything I had tried to hide was about to be exposed in a way I could not talk my way out of. I stared at the printed report showing photo metadata with timestamps. My last appearance at 10:07 and my return at 12:18. A gap of 2 hours and 11 minutes documented with forensic precision. Iris explained uncomfortably that she had accidentally sent me an email mentioning the timeline gap and hotel hallway cameras near the service elevator, and Owen's attorney Catherine showed proof I had opened that email on June 10th but never responded. Catherine pulled out witness statements from Simone, Margaret and wedding guests, plus Aaron's photo of me and Dominic at the coffee shop, Maya's video from the rooftop bar, and text message screenshots showing contact that began 3 days before the wedding and continued daily afterward. She slid the final document across, a petition for annulment based on fraud and concealment, already filed with King County Superior Court, case number 24-FL-8394. Catherine said service was happening now with Iris as witness, listing grounds of fraud through concealment of ongoing involvement with my ex, abandonment of marital duties on the wedding night, and a pattern of dishonesty rendering the marriage void from inception. I had 20 days to respond, but the evidence was overwhelming. Metadata, declarations, photos, texts, contradictory statements. I asked Owen if this was really what he wanted, and he said yes, he had loved the person he thought I was. But that person disappeared in the service corridor on our wedding night. Catherine said the petition requested division of gifts and reimbursement of half the wedding costs Margaret paid, incurred under false pretenses. She handed me an envelope with all documents and a hearing notice. July 8th, 10 o'clock, King County Superior Court. I walked to my car in a daze, called Dominic and told him about the annulment. He said it was for the best, and we should not see each other anymore because he did not want to be a witness in court, then hung up. I called my mother, and she said the grounds were accurate and she could not support me in a legal battle based on my own choices. I drove home to the apartment full of unpacked wedding gifts and read through the witness declarations, photo evidence, and text screenshots, seeing my lies documented with perfect clarity. The hearing was 3 weeks away, and I had 20 days to file a response, but looking at Owen's evidence, I could not imagine any defense that would work. My phone buzzed with the court notification July 8th, 10 a.m. I sat surrounded by wedding gifts I would return, honeymoon plans I would cancel, and a marriage I had destroyed on my wedding night for a man who would not answer my calls now that consequences had arrived. And I finally understood that 2 hours in a hotel hallway had cost me everything I thought I wanted.